Whenever I'm with John, especially on Zoom, he's always has a photo of the Sandia Mountains behind him, and these mountains are the in the landscape of his people. And I've found, and I think you will too, is John is very much of the landscape of his people. And though an educator in a very academic way, I have come, and I think you will too, to know John as a person who is of the land, and that he carries the spirit of his land, his ancients, and is a speaker of truth in a very natural way, and in the nurture of creation. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce, and I find this a privilege, John, to be able to welcome you into this space and with these people this afternoon.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for such kind and considerate words, Dave. Our friendship and our dialogue that we've shared over the past 3 years has been very informative and helpful. And I am ever grateful, and certainly I am humbled by your praise. But I would just like to let everyone know that what I present, how I present what I have, is really the voices of who my ancestors were. I would not be here without them. And oftentimes I've heard people say, I speak on behalf of these groups of people. I won't say that. What I would say is I speak because of them. It's because of who these human beings were that I get to be here in this time with you all. And so that's really the point or the story which I bring. So thank you very much, Dave. And thank you very much, Laura Jean, for your kind words and the thoughtful consideration in acknowledgement of the land. And certainly thank you, Clint, for a lot of things that you've talked about. And certainly, Nathan, I'm going to make some references to that. But first of all, in my mother's language, Gwazi Hopa, Gaita Awashra, Sa'awa Jemishet, do I hope Equia, to Hinume Jon Ghahate, Sanaya Eleanor, Sabapa Helen, Hinus Atsina, Gawaikume Ashui. And so in my mother's language, I said to you all, I greeted you all as my relatives, as human beings. And so that's how we as Pueblo people see all the other peoples throughout this planet of ours, because when we think about it in the scientific terms, we as human beings all are related. We all share the same DNA. And some of us are even related to the point that we can give our organs, our eyes, our hearts, our lungs, our blood to one another, because that's how we are all related. So that when we say we're related, that's what we look at, or how we perceive that construct. And I greeted you and I said, welcome and thank you for letting me here. I am Jon Ghahate. I'm from the Pueblos of Laguna and Zuni. My mother is Eleanor. My mother's mother is Helen. I'm from the Turkey and Badger clans. And with that introduction, that's the words and the languages we continue to use even in the year 2021. It gives us a sense of place. It gives a sense of being. And that's the narrative, and that's the focus and mission statement of the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to present some information. And so we'll begin with that. So do I have the option to share my screen? So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to share my screen with you because I have a presentation to show you all. Oh, so where did it go? Oh, close it. Sorry. I just inadvertently closed it. Let me bring that back up. Sorry. Where did it go? I apologize. So again, what I'm going to talk about is, and I know you have all been talking about the doctrine of discovery, but as my research and how I've begun to talk about this mentality, this approach into what provided the groups of people who came to the Western Hemisphere, what they felt it was their right to do, how they saw themselves as literally basically considering their world and how they saw the rest of the world. That's what this really is focusing on as it applies to the doctrine of discovery. I'm not sure. And so as Dave mentioned, if you look at this slide here, this is really a slide of a picture of the, oops, keep messing up. Here we go. Slideshow. Of our homelands as Pueblo people. This is a land on which our ancestors have thrived, created a society, created civilizations. And the important thing about these lands is we want to help our guests and those who we give presentations to is know that we've always been here. And when we think about telling a story, telling a narrative of who we are as people, just like any story, it has a beginning. Nathan mentions that it's always a good place to have the beginning, a start. And so when we think about that narrative, we also have to consider the words and terms we use, how we contribute information to one another. On your screen, you're going to see some statements we've seen throughout history, and those of us who know a little bit about world history, you've seen these statements more than once or twice in our historical recollection. These are very important points in our history as human beings, but they certainly are very limiting in what, at the time, how they were written and how they implied the mentality of the approach of one group to another group. And so if we use terms to try and describe history as it applies to human interactions, if we change just the simple terms within some of these statements, it changes the whole mentality of these statements. And so if we look at these terms and describe what human beings have done to one another, I'm trying to present is, as we as educators, we as trying to those who take ownership of our narrative, if we don't use the correct terms to show how we apply our knowledge to the rest of the world, how it really doesn't make sense. Nathan mentioned just a little bit ago when he talked about how the COVID virus has impacted our country within the past year. But then when you reflect upon all those other indigenous groups of people a century ago, they went through the same kind of pain, of suffering. And so when we think about terms of trying to help others understand where we're coming from, we have to think about the words we use. And when we talk about when we talk about how we present history, especially to those who feel that maybe history is not complete or that it's into their own interpretation. And just as I'm going to mention to you in a little bit, how we look at something called how we see one another. On November 3rd, on election night, you probably saw this on your television. When we think about those of us in what we now call the United States, when we think about who each individual group is, when one group feels it has the right to decide, well, I'm going to call you this or I'm going to call you that. When we look at this slide, it says that someone felt it was okay, that they had the same approach, the same mentality of the doctrine of discovery to say, I can have the right to tell you who you are. And therefore, those of us who are indigenous peoples were seen as something else in our greater society. So these terms are important, and that's why I focus on the terms. And as an educator, I teach predominantly science and math. And so if I'm talking to my students about, say, algebra, and if I use terms like exponents and variables and constants and other terms like that, if my students don't have a construct or a concept of comprehension of the words I'm using, all the information, all the knowledge, all the formulas I can give them really doesn't give them a sense of the grasping onto a construct. So that's why, as in my presentations, I do focus a lot on using terms and as it applies to how we present ourselves as indigenous peoples. And the reason why this is important, when we think about the release of the 1776 report, and you look on the side, you see what was included in the report. And thinking about what Nathan talked about, if we think about saying, we're going to read the books, these very historical books like the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, but say instead of starting at the very beginning, we decide, oh no, we're going to skip the first part. We're going to start at Samuel, or we're going to start at chapter 39, or we decide we're going to start at some other point in the book that we just arbitrarily choose. This is what the 1776 report has done. And as I will show you and present to you, the human beings who have lived in the Western Hemisphere have had a legacy of civilization on this side of the world, and the impact of the doctrine of discovery on those lives, even today, and how we see that as it applies to who we are as indigenous peoples. As Americans, we're often taught and we're told this is the history of us as United States citizens. I can remember this because this is what I was taught when I think about my teacher who taught me high school history. And this is the images that we see as it applies to the development of what this country eventually will become. And certainly the same way as it applies to all that we will continue, even today, that is the basis of the 1776 Commission. Some people choose to not see the real component of this history. And when those who want to bring to the front that there's parts of this history that's missing, I'm going to move my screen here, and there's parts of this history that's missing, we're often accused of being revisionists, that we want to change history. Well, we then proclaim and we take ownership of that narrative, saying we're not changing history. What we're doing is we're contributing the part that you left out, that you ignored, that you chose to completely avoid because perhaps maybe it didn't present you in the best light. That's what the doctrine of discovery is about. And certainly as we think about US history, this is what we know. However, in this country, there are many components of the civilizations that existed here. Let me briefly tell you, when I think about time as it applies to history, I'm going to briefly show you something, and let's think about this clock. If 1 minute goes by, 100 years goes by. Okay, just think of this clock as time going backwards. And Nathan mentioned this about that timeline that we were presented in with some of our doctrine of discovery talks, that we look at time because it's helpful. We can make that reflection. So let's go back 1 minute in time from 2021. So 100 years ago, these are the most predominant things that occurred in this country, just in this country alone. Women didn't have the right to vote. We were going through a very severe Spanish flu. Native Americans were not considered citizens. It took another 4 years before they were seen as US citizens. And the real emphasis of expansionism was really sweeping across what we now call the United States. Let's go back to another minute, to another 200 years ago. The United States was barely a country at the time. The United States is acquiring more expansionism as it expanded across the western side of what we now call North America. New Mexico was not a state. There was only some states that were part of the United States at the time. There was less than 25 states at the time. And at the time also, some of you have mentioned too in your discussions about the Indian schools. The Indian schools were getting started. The first Indian school was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So when we think about time as a relative point of reference, this is just thinking about how we as US citizens are impacted by this time reference. So I'm going to go back 2 minutes. So we're going back 4 minutes ago to the 1700s. The United States was not even somebody's idea of a country at the time. That the first groups of colonists were coming. The Washington Post posted a series of articles this last year or 2 years ago in 2019 about the 1619 history of the introduction of slaves into the colonies. As I will show you, slavery has been in the Western Hemisphere at least a millennia before that. And so those are the stories that we want to help present and provide people with an understanding that the history has been neglectful as it applies to the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to go back 1 minute to 5 minutes ago. Columbus barely came across to the Western Hemisphere. And as you'll show on the right-hand side, these are the papal bulls that were mentioned and how they impacted the Western Hemisphere. But the underlying premise of a papal bull is the fact that someone felt it was their right, that they were justified, that they could choose how they could define another person. The papal bulls initially within the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Granada were basically to address those peoples that were living in what we now call Spain at the time that were not seen as Christian. Anybody who was a Jew, a Saracen, a person who was Islam, somebody who was maybe a destitute or a poor person, that the kingdom and the church at the same time felt they did not chose, or they decided that individual was not human enough to receive the good news of the Christian faith. That's the basis and the underlying premise of the doctrine of discovery. And I'm going to change that mentality now. I'm going to start saying the doctrines of discovery, because the doctrine of discovery is not just one single concept. It consists of a mentality that precedes the Spanish crown. Before the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Granada, we have St. Thomas Aquinas and Greek philosophers at least a century, at least a whole millennia before that, who felt that due to natural law, that there's always going to be people who were going to be slaves. There were always going to be people that did not fit the normal strata of society, and therefore one group could choose that they are not valued as the rest of the other people. So that's the concept of natural law, that there are certain things that God established that we as human beings can follow. And if you choose not to follow it, then you're at your own demise. And so the doctrines of discovery are not just one construct. There are many groups of constructs. And if you look at the Bible, you see that even before in the Old Testament, there were slaves that were being traded, humans' lives that were being traded, peoples that were being killed because they did not fit the standard or the natural norm of those who were in power. Let's go back to 10 to 15,000 years ago. The number 8 that I show you there, that's when Jesus was born, 2,000 years ago. But in the Western Hemisphere, if you look at those things, at the time Jesus was born, there were civilizations in this side of the world that we know about. That change in scientific data has been become more prominent with this changes and the improvement in science understanding and the interpretation of certain things. About 50 years ago, most scientists felt that human beings didn't come into this side of the world, perhaps only maybe about 15,000 years ago. Within the past 15 years, that has changed. Now people are even saying up to 35 to 40,000 years ago that humans were here on this side of the world. And we can see evidence of that. If you go to any museum in the eastern side, you see mastodon skeletons and other species that were hunted by human beings using Folsom points and other groups of peoples that were living here. And so those human beings have always been living here. And so this is what we want to understand, that the United States is simply only a small period of time compared to the human existence of peoples that have lived in the Western Hemisphere. This is just a quick snapshot of the groups of people that were living in the Southwest, at least a millennia before Europeans even came to the Western Hemisphere. So 1,000 years ago, before 1492, at least before just before Jesus was born, people were living here. And at the time that the Europeans began to expand westward into the Western Hemisphere, one of the first questions they asked, as Dave pointed out, was they began to ask, well, are these human? Can they know God? And then the most important thing is, should they know God? And this was a dilemma in the background in which we then now base the concepts and the premises of the doctrine of discovery. And so because of that, that's why I said I put doctrines with a little brackets there, because it's really not just one construct. It's the mentality of many kings, the church, and many individuals who are philosophers who began to feel that it was their right to decide who could be human, who could be seen as having a soul, who could be seen as worthy of the Christian faith, and most importantly, who was worthy to be seen as fodder for colonization, for genocide, for ethnocide, and all the other things that are part of expansionism of one specific peoples. The word I use for the institutionalization of the mentality of the doctrines of discovery is when it's married with church and state. And as I'll mention a little bit later on, this is still very prevalent today, even 5,000 years later, that groups of individuals that are within the church, within the government and politics, feel that it's their right that they can decide who deserves what. They choose not to listen to the voices. They choose not to incorporate the knowledge and the voices of those groups of people. I'm going to quickly go over some of the papal bulls and the basis of the findings of the doctrines of discovery, that it was an evolutionary process. The first papal bulls that were coming out in the early part of the 15th century were basically ways that the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Barcelona, and Granada were trying to establish a Catholic state. But they needed to have buy-in by the monarchs and those who were in power. So it was an evolution of an idea of policies that were eventually used to expand this pattern of policies, that how it governed these groups of people. But without the papal influence, without the papal justification, these laws would have not been a part of it. As long as the monarchs of many parts of Europe were very indoctrinated to the dogma of the Christian church, they would not have been as forceful in making sure these groups of people could be seen as something other than who they were. I'll contrast this with the Roman Empire, or with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is certainly very traumatic and forceful and expansionism. However, when they came across to different groups of people, they certainly were not a theocracy. They were certainly an autocracy. But when they came across different groups, they gave them a choice. They said, okay, you can live your life just as long as you pay your taxes to the emperor, you can continue. And so that's why we get that old saying, when in Rome, you're a Roman. They didn't force them. Certainly they killed many people, certainly yes, but they said, well, you just keep your customs. You can be a pagan or an idolater if you want, but just pay your bills and your taxes to the Roman crown and a Roman Empire, and fine, we'll take you into service, we'll give you a job, but it's not because of a philosophy or a dogma, it's because of a autocracy. Whereas with the papal bulls, it required the justification, the sanctioning of the Catholic Church. And certainly even the earliest Christians were persecuted because it was this divide of how they were seen in the interpretation of the teachings of Jesus. And gradually through the Reformation, we see that even some groups of Christians who were seen as Christians were not really accepted within the Catholic Church. And we even see that today, because we can see how even when you think about the Christian church, think about all the different denominations that exists, how one group feels that its interpretation of the Bible is different than another group of interpretation of the Bible. Even the Methodist Church this past couple of years has had a significant divide because one group says, well, let's invite our gay and lesbian and queer church members, and others choose not to. Again, this is part of that dogma that was not anything new. It's been going on for centuries within the Christian church. And then certainly we can always include that prejudice, that animus that even the Christian church has against, or some people in the Christian church have against those who are Jews. We even have a denomination within the Christian church that says Jews for Jesus, because they certainly perhaps don't deny their Jewish heritage, but they incorporate and take hold of the constructs of the Christian faith. But even then, think about what happened in Charlottesville last year, when you had white people, mostly men, who were probably Christians, maybe they were a part of the Baptist Church, Southern Baptists in those countries, who were saying Jews will not replace us. That's the dilemma, that's the premise of the doctrines of discovery that's still alive and well. But it has its origins centuries ago. These are some of the very prominent papal bulls that we see, that we can look back at the Christian church. We can go to the archives of the Vatican, and I've had that opportunity to see the impact of each of these papal bulls as it's trying to formulate a doctrine, so that certainly their faith, their zealous mentality to spread the Christian faith was very much a part of their lives. And so they incorporated these policies, but without the force and the existence of certain monarchies, the church would not have had that opportunity to do that. Some of the papal bulls began to be part of the Spanish Inquisition that forced people to choose under the threat of death. And many times there were those within the Christian church and the monarchies that were saying, well, if you're forcing someone to accept the Christian church under duress, how can you really tell their faith is true? How can you tell their faith is truly authentic? And this is an ongoing discussion that was part of the Spanish Inquisition. And we see that even today, that sometimes people challenge or question another person's faith. But as the Bible states, how can you tell one's faith? How can you tell how God has intervened and give them some knowledge that Jesus is the Savior? Or how can someone say that Muhammad is the true God? And how can someone say that Yahweh is the true God? Those are the things that even the Christian church still deals with today. But all of these things are very important and have influenced us as Pueblo peoples, as I was showing you a little bit, because the impact of this Spanish crown, the impact of the doctrines of discovery are most fundamental on the presence, the colonization, and the existence of Spanish expansionism within the Southwest here in what we now call the state of New Mexico. One very individual that's a very strong proponent of the doctrine of discovery was Isabella. But perhaps one of the things that we know about Isabella, the Queen of Aragon at the time, and then eventually married Ferdinand, and then formed what we now call the country of Spain, is that she certainly was very anti-Jewish and anti-Islam. But she also felt at one point that the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere should be treated a little more mercifully. The papal bulls, basically their intention was to make sure that the Christian church could spread the Christian faith. That it certainly was, as Nathan mentioned, when we look, if you have the opportunity to go to Europe, like Barcelona, Madrid, even Italy, and you go to any of those magnificent churches, and they are magnificent, but look at the gold that is in those churches. All that gold came from the Western Hemisphere. All that silver that you see is part of the chalice or other components within the church came from the Western Hemisphere, under the expense of all those indigenous peoples who had lived here for at least a millennia in civil, stable, agrarian, permanent civilizations. That's the legacy of the doctrines of discovery and the impact on the Western Hemisphere. This is a picture of a mentality that most monarchs, the church, and most scientists at the time had of the earth prior to 1300. They felt that the earth consisted of only three continents, and that there was this big ocean all around. And most of us, perhaps some of you, including myself, when we're taught about Columbus, we're often taught that Columbus was informed that the world was flat. And that's quite wrong. Most scientists, at least 300 to 400 years prior to Columbus's being alive, already began to accept the idea that our world was a ball floating around somewhere in space. Copernicus proved that. However, the one thing that they didn't realize was how big the earth was. Columbus thought that the earth was much smaller, that he could sail at least 3, possibly 5 months west and eventually reach what we now call China. At the time it was called Asia. And oftentimes we're taught about how history is that the Western expansion, the expansion into the Western Hemisphere was because of gold. Marco Polo, 300 years prior to Columbus, had already been to Asia. He had brought back spices and ceramics and silk and other things, but it was really not gold. At the time, Europe was getting most of its gold from Africa. And that's why we have the African in the right-hand corner of that page, that European monarchs and the church understood that there was a continent below them. They just didn't think there was something much larger than that. And so what Columbus felt was he wanted to get to Asia for all those spices, because many efforts have been made to go around Africa. They eventually made it just a couple of months prior to Columbus reaching the Caribbean. But eventually his main goal was to get to Asia for all those riches and commodities that were part of what Marco Polo had brought back. It was not gold, but that's what we're told. And that's why we try to change that narrative, that we would look at the diaries of Columbus and other contemporaries at the time, that it was not gold that drove them to seek another route to the East Asia. I'm going to skip by these. One of these papal bulls came in 1493 after Columbus had come across the Hispaniola, which we now call Dominican Republic and Haiti. That whole island was called Hispaniola in 1492. As westward expansion is moving toward into the Western Hemisphere, the Portuguese predominantly and the Spanish were fighting over one another, saying, I was here first. No, I was here first. No, this is my land. No, this is my land. So the king of Portugal and the king of Kingdom of Spain went to the Catholic Pope and asked him if he would settle this. And what he came up with this papal bull in 1493, and in the middle of or pretty close to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is the island we now call the Azores. And what he did, he said, okay, I'm going to take the western shore of the Azores. I'm going to go 100 leagues west of that. And at the time, a league is about 3.2 miles. And so there's a little over 320 miles west of the Azores. And he drew a line straight north and south. And so he said by proclamation that all the lands on the eastern side of that line belong to Portugal, and all the lines on the western side of that line belong to Spain. And so now if you look at the west of South America, even today, you see the eastern coast, the eastern side of South America is predominantly Portuguese influence. And you see on the western side of South America is predominantly Spanish influence, because someone felt it was their right to do that. Just like we see after World War I, that as well as World War II, that some monarchs could get together and say, okay, well, let's divide up the Middle East and we're going to decide what countries here, what countries there. And that's why we see those problems that exist today, like in Israel, in Palestine, and other places in the Eastern Hemisphere. And more predominantly here in the United States, that after the Civil War and as expansionism expanding into the Western side, and then after the Indian Wars, the United States government tries to deal with this Indian issue, and they decide to separate the pueblos of Hopi in Arizona and the Navajos, and they create these land issues. Well, that land issue is still going on today. And that land issue was created because someone felt they had the right to do that. They didn't ask the people whose lives would be impacted by that. And so the doctrines of discovery, unfortunately, is still very much alive and well in 2021. I'm going to go past this here. Now, Nathan mentioned something called the recuermento. The recuermento was a policy that was part of the papal bulls, the doctrines of discovery. As westward expansion is moving forward, there were some people within the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Granada who felt that the reports that were coming back from a man by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas, that the treatment of the indigenous peoples was horrific, that it really wasn't what the church should be seen as. And so what the recuermento was formulated to do was basically a justification. As the Spanish were moving into all of these places in the Western Hemisphere, that they would announce, and this is just a portion of this, if you can read it while I'm talking, it was just a portion of it. And what it basically said that was, we are here representing the church, our God, our King. that we can come into your, wherever you live, that we can take your children, we can enslave you, we can do what we choose to do, and that it will not be our fault. We will be held with impunity. We will not be accountable because it's you who chose to deny or refuse what we have to offer, which is the good news of the Christian faith. And so this small segment is a report from Bartholomew de las Casas in 1542, as he was becoming now a Dominican priest in the Western Hemisphere, seeing the plight of indigenous peoples in predominantly the Caribbean, that the impact of the Spanish on these communities was horrific, to the point that they were opening up women's wombs to take out their children, burning them at stake. And one of them is a drawing from that period of time there. One of these drawings is taken from one of the soldiers that drew these pictures in the 1600s, as westward expansion is moving into the lives of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Bartholomew de las Casas wrote the brief account of the destruction of the Indies in 1542. It certainly changed the approach of the Spanish as they were moving into the Western Hemisphere. It was adopted by Queen Isabella. The one unfortunate thing about this is that even though this was a doctrine that spurred dialogue of how they were going to treat indigenous peoples, the problem that existed is that there was no one locally to police those who were representatives of the Spanish crown. So because it took at least 3 to 4 months to get information from one side of the Western Hemisphere to the other side of the Eastern Hemisphere. So there was whole times and periods where people were treated nevertheless the same, even though many of these laws had been changed in the treatment of indigenous peoples. And this brings me to how I speak on behalf, or how I speak because of our Pueblo peoples here in the Southwest. Because in speaking about the doctrines of discovery, oftentimes we seem to start at when the colonists came to the North America. The earliest colonists came in 1607 in Jamestown, then in 1620 in Plymouth Rock. But as I'm going to show you briefly, the civilizations that existed here in the Southwest have been here for at least a millennia, even before 1607. And perhaps one of the benefits as peoples that live here in the Southwest, we can see evidence of these civilizations that existed. As I'll show you here, they were permanent, sedentary, agrarian societies that through what we now call STEM concepts, science, technology, engineering, and math, that these civilizations would not have been able to exist without incorporating biology, physics, chemistry, astronomy, architectural science, and many other components of STEM, because it's those constructs that allows peoples who have lived in this massive structure that we see here in New Mexico to provide a livable, sustainable society, that you have food for all your population, that you have some sense of normality and political structure and stability, that you don't have a constant warfare, because these groups of people lived in this spot for at least 500 years. That's twice as long as the United States has been a country. And so these groups of people is evidence that these civilizations existed, but it required some knowledge, some incorporation of problem-solving skills, some components of individual thinking, ingenuity, to know that how we build a society is dependent upon the human endeavors. Just briefly, quickly, here in the Western Hemisphere, if you've had some cornmeal today, if you've had corn mush, if you've had popcorn, if you've had a pizza with tomato sauce on it, if you had ketchup today, if you smoke, If you had anything in November, we had celebrated with turkey. You would not have those things without the indigenous peoples learning how to incorporate their environment to be able to provide these things. If you've had a bison burger, all of these things are indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. Prior to 1492, none of those things were known in the Eastern Hemisphere. And if you've had a pizza, think about certainly Italy is well known for its pizza, but pizza is not indigenous to Italy because we know that flour really comes from Mesopotamia, what we now call in Iraq and Iran. Tomatoes come from the Western Hemisphere. Also, if you like spaghetti, well, spaghetti noodles don't come from Italy. The first introduction of noodles comes from Asia and China at the time by Marco Polo in the 12th century. And tomatoes certainly, like I said, come from here. So this is the impact of the indigenous peoples on the rest of a greater world that sometimes people choose to ignore. That's what I hope to bring to the discussion when we talk about the doctrines of discovery, the impact of all the groups of people. The last one, medicinal and herbal therapies. We know that people with certain cardiovascular diseases use something called digoxin, which comes from a specific plant called foxglove. They were using many of those kinds of drugs and therapies here in the Western Hemisphere as well, long before it was synthesized to produce a drug that we now use by probably some of us who are seen by cardiologists that are given this particular subscription. Celestial observations were part of many of these civilizations as well. And most importantly, perhaps as I'll explain in just a bit, for the Spanish, as they came especially to this area, at some point they saw the indigenous peoples here in what we now call New Mexico as perhaps having some degree of spiritual constructs, some existential components of belief systems. And so they felt that they were able to be proselytized to be worked and converted to Christianity. But as human beings, we know that long before, even the development of many civilizations, human beings as a society have always understood some sense that there's a spirit, there's something in us as human beings, because we can look at many of these places where Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon species have buried their relatives. Well, animals don't bury their relatives. Some animals mourn, like primates, like elephants. They know a loss of a community member, but as human beings, they have a process and celebration of that person's life by burying them and putting them in the ground, having a ceremony with some trinkets or whatever component of their lives to acknowledge the fact that this person was alive. That's that concept of the spiritual constructs of existential belief system. Real quickly, the Spanish began to colonize the Americas with a belief that it was theirs for the taking, that God had given, as Nathan said, God had given us this land. And as the parable of the landowner gives each of his workers something of value and then goes back to them and says, what have you done, kind and faithful servant? Have you generated more than what I gave you, or have you hid it underneath something? That's the mentality and the justification of the premise of the doctrines of discovery, that our God has given us this land and we therefore can use it to our benefit. And so many of these things are part of our culture, even before, at least 200 years before the United States even becomes the United States. Our Pueblo people were living here. Our Pueblo people had a culture. Our Pueblo people had permanent sedentary agrarian societies with spiritual constructs. The most important thing about any society when we think about the development of human beings is that groups of people develop a language. We have 7 different distinct languages within our Pueblo communities. That's just our Pueblo communities. Then we have our neighbors that are not considered Pueblo. They have other languages as well. And so even 200 years before the Spanish even came to our part of the world, there was commerce. We know that people were trading with people from Mexico, what we now call Mexico, that when people go through, the archaeologists go through many of these places, they'll find cocoa beans, parrot feathers, macaw feathers. Well, none of those things are grown here or indigenous to the Southwest. They're from down south. And if you go down south into places like Guatemala and Central America, you find elements of turkeys and other things that were part of this part of the world even before the Spanish even came. The colonization of the Pueblo peoples began in the 1600s. The recuartamiento, as I mentioned, was a policy that the Spanish crown was a written document that they would read to the Pueblos as they were coming into the communities, saying, we're here representing the crown, and if you choose not to accept what we have, it is our right to do that. The second policy was called the Encomida, and the Encomida was basically a feudal system of tribute and slavery. And the last one was called the Repartimiento, and the Repartimiento was basically another feudal construct that basically forced Pueblo peoples to provide food, housing, and other components to whomever was going to be colonizing. And part of that also construct is part of what the individuals in Jamestown and Plymouth Rock encountered too, because each of those times those peoples came, they were either low on their provisions, they were at a time when they came when the weather was not the best, probably late fall, early winter. And without the help of the indigenous peoples who lived there at the time, they would not have survived. They would not have continued and allowed themselves to have a community because of the generosity of the Pueblo, of the indigenous peoples in those areas. In New Mexico, these are the very prominent historical constructs that we see that are part of our narrative as Pueblo people. Again, this is even little under 100 years before the United States become the United States, that these policies were part of the Spanish crown's authority over the Pueblo people. And let me also mention about our Pueblo people. We as individual Pueblo people, I said who I was in my mother's language, a Gawait Gomeh. That means I am who these people are of these people that live in this area. In my father's language, I would say I Ashui. That means I'm with this other group. We already had names for ourselves. The Spanish came across these groups of people and perhaps saw them in a different perspective than those who were not seen in that same level, like those who were somewhat nomadic, maybe somewhat still in a non-permanent sedentary situation of their society. And as a result, they began to refer to the communities that they saw. Well, there's a group of houses over here. That's a pueblo, because in Spanish, that's what pueblo means. It means group of houses or a town or people. And then eventually they say, oh, there's another pueblo over there. There's another pueblo over there. And so they began to refer to these communities that they found in the 16th century. And eventually they began to refer to the people as an individual as a pueblo. Oh, you're a pueblo. You're a pueblo because you live in this community. And those are neighbors that were not in that same level. They're not pueblo. So currently here in the United States, we have 573 federally recognized Native American groups. Some people say tribes. I choose to say groups. Of those 573, only 21 fall under the term pueblo because of that designation that's applied by the Spanish, because of that acceptance of who they were as human beings. And certainly they worked to Christianize them. And if anybody has the opportunity to come down to New Mexico and visit many of our pueblos, and you go right into our communities, the one predominant structure you're going to see in the middle of our communities is a Catholic church. To build a Catholic church, to work to Christianize and evangelize to another group of people, you first have to determine, well, is this person worthy of the Christian faith? Is this person a human being? Because you don't work to Christianize cats or dogs, monkeys, primates, trees or rocks. The premise of the Christian faith is that you're saving a soul. You're saving someone from the damnation of what the Bible says would be eternal torment. But you have to, the first premise is you see them as a human being. But the dilemma that exists is, do I as a human being have to prove myself to you, another human being, that I'm human? What is it I can do to show you that I'm human? Was it really just your responsibility to see me as a human being? You don't need proof. And so that's what we think about as the premises behind the doctrine of discovery. Eventually, New Mexico becomes part of the Mexican territory, and then eventually becomes part of the United States in 1846, after the 1848, after the Mexican-American War. And so even though we think about, as Nathan mentioned about the manifest destiny, I forgot. How am I doing on time? Somebody help me, let me know if I'm on time, okay? That Western expansion is part of that mentality of God's gift to us, that we can choose to what it does and how we choose to use that. As it applies to our indigenous peoples of all the 50 states, including our indigenous relatives in Hawaii and our indigenous relatives up in Alaska, that mentality is still very prevalent. To be not seen as human, as that one slide shows you on election day, that they cannot take the time to see who we are. We're something else. And so the doctrine of discovery will be a continued component of the institutionalization of marginalization, of continued ostracization. And people will have, recently with all this turmoil that's going on in our country, people will say, well, Black Lives Matters, people have found their voice. LGBT people have found their voice. Women have found their voice. Well, the thing about that statement is groups of people who have always been marginalized, who have been used force against them, have always had a voice. They've always cried out. They've always said, hey, what about me? The thing that existed, the problem that exists, is those that in power refuse to acknowledge those voices. They choose to ignore them and not give credit to those voices. That's what the concept of institutionalization of the doctrine of discovery is that the church and government have bonded together to allow these things to exist. And we see that even today with the concepts that are tearing our country apart as it applies to the white nationalism. This is a map of our current communities. These are the places our people have always lived on. We share the land, we share the concepts, we share our languages. And most importantly, it gives us a sense of identity, a sense of place, that we belong here and that we will always be here, and that we take ownership of our languages, we take ownership of who we are as human beings, and we take ownership that we can have the right to do that. And so in the end, being aware of this certainly will create some sense of emotion, and I hope that it does that. But I also hope it helps us understand that what we can do and how we do it is helpful in changing the paradigm and the language of this country, because it's been this way too long. A lot of my indigenous friends and relatives and people I know will say, well, we should get the land back. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I just think that we just need to learn how to be accommodating to one another. Certainly understand that this is the way history is, and we should work to encourage that. And if anybody has any questions, I certainly will be glad to answer any questions at all. I also, if you, a little bit later on, Dave will share my email if you want, any resources, the books I use, and whatever resources I have, I'll be glad to pass that along to you. And I want to thank you for this invitation to talk with you and share with you what I've learned and a little bit about the voices of who I am as a Pueblo person. Thank you very much. Alakwa, dawa.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Blessings. I think we are moving into our breakout rooms.
I would say that overall, let's do our best at, if you got something to talk about, you should just open up and start talking about that. But what I would also encourage, if not, if you need something to get going, is give some thought to your history. Let's recognize that there was a time where all the women here didn't have the right to vote. There was a time when all the people of color here were kept segregated from folks of color. All the folks of color were separated from white folks. For change to occur, somebody had to speak up and somebody had to act. And yet we know that for that to happen, there was a lot of fear there. So if you need a question to get going, when we think about the doctrines of discovery as Jon talks about it, maybe consider that for change to happen, to bring about indigenous justice, action is going to have to happen. folks will have to talk to their neighbor. You will have to get up and talk about this in your congregation, and that will be fearful. So maybe take a moment and give some thought. What is it that moved your parents or your grandparents beyond their fear to buck up against the law, to buck up against social norms and constructs of their day? And how might we learn from them so that we can incorporate that into our own lives? So let's give that a little bit of thought so that we move into a conversation of how do we help our Indigenous kin and ourselves all in the same moment.
And while she is doing that, I'll invite you all to kind of follow the same format we did earlier. I want to, my job is to facilitate. I'll try not to overtake that completely with my own questions and thoughts. So I want to hear from you all, and so put those questions in the chat box if you've got them, or some comments, because we have an opportunity with Jon here to kind of flesh some of these things out. And it was I think we in our room talked a lot about we were focusing on that question of when our forebears kind of bucked up, and we had these moments of we're not sure they bucked up as much as we might think they did, and we talked about that struggle of coming to that place. And I think maybe Jon, you kind of mentioned this, that there's a defensiveness almost toward starting to name these type of systemic concerns on the part of privileged folks, and I've been trying to facilitate to find the words. I've been wanting to ask this question since early in your presentation. I'm still not sure I know exactly how to do it, but I'm going to hold that because I see some of the other questions here that are kind of popping up. I'll toss you to one of those. So here's a good one. A question came out. You mentioned using the term groups versus tribes, and I think that might be a good place, especially for white folk like me, who grew up in an area where I wasn't surrounded by Indigenous folks. Tell us a little more about your reasoning on that.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, certainly. The reason why I choose to use that word is, if we think about the people in a country, like say Italy or Germany or Japan, we don't call them tribes. What the word tribe implies, it doesn't necessarily mean it, but implies the fact that these are just a group of people, that they're just somehow collective. But when we say they're a country, it denotes some sense of sovereignty, some sense that they have the right to govern themselves, that they have the right to make laws that allows them to be seen as acceptable amongst a collective group of countries. Tribes is basically a term that was used and has been used even now, that is just simply says, you're just a group, but I don't give you certain recognition of the right to be seen as valid. And so when we think about Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations having the right to be sovereign, to be heard in a court of law, to have the right to say, you know what, this is against who we are, and I have the right to be heard in a court of law. That's what gives validity to a group of people. The United States has not signed on to the World Court because they are afraid that other countries who have signed on to the World Court would take them to task and say, you're doing wrong. The United States is one of the few countries that has not signed into the World Court. To be not seen as valid, to not be seen as someone who has the right to be heard, is really what sovereignty means. That's why I simply use that word. And like I said, that's why I focus on terminology as something a part of how I present this. But to be seen as a nation, to be seen as a group that has the right to govern itself implies a lot. And so that's why I kind of present that out there.
Yes, thank you.
Does that answer your question, Kate or Kat? Kat posed that question.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful distinction. And I know it was certainly a learning when I moved into Oklahoma and lived amongst the territory of the Cherokee, the Western Cherokee Nation. Learning that language of nation was really helpful because you're right, it even shifted the way I thought to use. I hadn't considered kind of the weight and the baggage that comes with our words, as you've been pointing out. So I think that is important there.
Can I just preface that with something just real briefly?
Sure.
When the Spanish came, certainly again, they worked certainly to Christianize the people. Again, the premise that one has to take before you work to Christianize, you accept them as a human being. Eventually, the Spanish crown made a policy called the Four Square Leagues policy, which began to identify lands that belonged to these different communities here in what we now call the state of New Mexico. That was a policy within the Spanish crown. That policy then transferred over when Mexico acquired all these lands, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Utah, when it defeated Spain and won its independence in 1821. Then when the United States acquired all these lands, in signing the Treaty of the Guadalupe Hidalgo, where now all these lands are part of the United States territory, that same mentality of accepting them as indigenous sovereign groups transferred over with that treaty. And so we as Pueblo people have been fortunate compared to many of our other indigenous neighbors throughout what we now call the United States, because a sovereign, the Spanish crown, accepted us as having the right to govern ourselves, to actually literally be here and have some degree of representation, being accepted as Spanish citizens first, subsequently Mexican citizens, and then subsequently part of the United States, but never really being seen as citizens by the United States until 1824. So that's what why it means to us to have the lands and to be seen as sovereign.
And that's a helpful contextualizing to put the maybe, I don't know, an advantage that Pueblo peoples have had because of the shape of history, if you will, and the way that is played out. And so it kind of brings into to light that reminder too that maybe tribes also help us shrink peoples into a monolith when it's not. And so there are two questions that I've seen pop up here, and I'm going to kind of put them together as a part one and part two, maybe. One of them, which is, what are good ways for us, particularly as white folks, to get a better understanding for the stories and the context, the histories of people in our areas? Do you have some suggestions for how we might go about better learning that? And then another question that came up, and I'm reluctant to throw this one at you, but I'm going to toss it out there because I think it's worth conversing. As a white person, I hate to ask you, so what should I do next? Because the work of anti-racism is my work, and I need to figure that out. But I think there's also a space for hearing from indigenous peoples. If you had a say, what would you want us to hear about what would you want us to see us do? So how do we learn more, and how do we listen to you about what should we do next?
Well, those are very good questions, and certainly those are the kinds of questions we get from many of our guests who visit us. And you're asking two questions, although they're similar. One applies to academic knowledge, and one applies to existential knowledge. And so academic knowledge we can learn, and certainly what we learn from that academic knowledge is dependent upon whom we read. If we go to that 1776 Presidential Commission and read that, if I was a history teacher, I'd give that an F minus, because it, like I said, it starts out in 1607, but what about before that? Okay, when we think about in that regard. So if I gave this assignment to a student of mine and I started reading it, it's, well, what happened to the beginning? So like I said, if you're going to look at the Bible and you start out in Samuel, well, what happened to Genesis, Exodus, and all those other books that came before that? So that's what we can look at, understand that how academic knowledge is one component. And then existential knowledge is that as human beings, we all have a sense that there's something out there greater than who we are. What is perhaps problematic is that one group can feel it has the right to say, well, my understanding of spirituality is better than yours.
Mhm.
Certainly we see this with the extremism of certain religions, and how one group can feel that because I'm a Sunni Muslim or I'm a Shiite Muslim, mine is better than yours. I can, and therefore it gives me the right to do the atrocities that I have. That the Christian church says, oh, well, the Catholic church has this dogma, and this other church has this dogma, that there's always battle. But I thought you had the same God. And so by understanding those kinds of uh, um, approaches and concepts, even within the church itself, it has problems. Then those outside the church are wondering, how come you're fighting amongst yourself? I thought you guys had the same belief systems. Okay. And so I think looking at it in that regard, we can say, let's look at the academic knowledge, see what history has to say, expand our knowledge and horizon, but then look at the existential knowledge and say, well, is everybody equal? Our souls can be equal? Can your practices of spirituality be acceptable to me, even though certainly I believe in the Christian faith? If I believe in the Christian faith, can I tolerate your difference in your approach to your spirituality? Does that help?
I think so. By packaging that together, I'm encompassing a couple of questions from a couple of groups, so I don't know how to get too much more feedback off of that. But I think that was a very helpful answer, and I appreciated your distinction between the academic knowledge and the existential, and what that means. When you opened that question, I wasn't sure I knew where you were going with that, but you explained it very well, and I think that was a meaningful division. And I think both and working together are really helpful for us to think about how we listen to stories that are not our own, and also how we can learn from them. And in some ways, the idea of the existential knowledge, I think you did a nice job of answering my question about what should we white folks do next by inviting us how to think differently about what we do next instead of telling us. And I think that's both helpful, coming from a white perspective, but also reminds us that we have an onus to own the anti-racism part of our anti-racism and pro-reconciling ministries too. So yeah, I thought that was very helpful in that regard, John.
But let me add just real quickly. Think about when the Nazis came into France. Okay, that certainly the French army, the French people fought against them. A lot of people were getting killed, and at some point, they're coming to realize, this is not a good idea. We're all going to get killed. And so they began to say, well, okay, I'll do the Heil Hitler thing. I'll pretend to be a convert to the idea of Nazism, but clandestinely, they're going to have a resistance. They're going to go underneath. And so that's the same thing that sometimes people will say, well, I'll do the sign of the cross and I'll go to church, but my belief systems, how can we, whose right is it to discern your faith or another person's faith? Do we have that knowledge? Do we have that capability? Even the Bible says we don't. So that's the dilemma we as human beings confront, that we can't know one person's true faith. Maybe if there's a meteor coming toward us that we're all going to get killed, maybe that'll bring out the true believers, and the pretend ones will say, well, whatever. So that's that dilemma that exists between existential knowledge and academic knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great example. Thank you. I know we're running right up against our time, but I see this last question from Nathan come in. It's a very concrete one, and I think it's worth kind of closing our question and answers here with that. He was wondering if you could talk about, John, about the impact of the pandemic on your nation and the other communities in the area. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Certainly, I'll be glad to. Well, first of all, I'm also a healthcare practitioner. My primary career is I was a healthcare provider for more than 20 years, and I decided to leave medicine. I'm a physician assistant trained in specialized in orthopedic surgery, and then I wanted to teach science and math, so I got my teaching degree in high school biology, physics, chemistry, and calculus, and then I somehow got this job. So I do know that the impact of healthcare on our communities. For the indigenous communities throughout the United States, especially those in the lower 48, it's dependent upon the Indian Health Service. The Indian Health Service, its responsibilities, its job has been inadequate, to say the least. Not only in the fact that the funding has never increased since the Reagan era, it's really has not kept up with the cost of medicine as a whole. And so even though you hear on the radio, NPR, the news, I'm talking about the Navajo Nation, and certainly they do talk about this remoteness of these communities, not having enough water. What it comes down to, and we can also make this same equivalent with our other people, neighbors and relatives who are people of color, our African American neighbors, our Hispanic neighbors, is that because of the economic inequality that exists in this country, they might have higher incidences of diabetes, heart disease, and other issues only because the healthcare system is inadequate. Not because they live in a certain area, certainly that's part of it too, but it's only because what it takes to have a sustainable, equitable healthcare system is so dependent on the economy. And so that's why it's impacted us as indigenous peoples. But there are those who have benefited from being trained in healthcare systems. We have many indigenous peoples who are healthcare providers, not just nurses and allied healthcare people, but doctors. We have had people who have contributed to the expansion of research in healthcare. And so certainly this pandemic has put at great risk and tested those who don't have an equitable sense of healthcare. And so those, there are white people who live in impoverished conditions. They're suffering too, just along with other Native peoples. It's just because of the healthcare systems not being adequate to care for other peoples. We know that also with reports that people who are getting immunized, only those areas that have better hospitals, better healthcare systems, they're getting immunized first, whereas those that don't have a local hospital or local healthcare systems aren't getting immunized. So it's not so much the fact that you're a person of color or ethnicity, it's the economics of it have contributed to that disparity that exists. And so I hope that this current administration looks at that to try and address that issue for all of us, because if your neighbor who is maybe not at the same level of you economically is sick, it puts you at risk nevertheless. If they travel on go to the same store, go into the same bus, or go into the same community center, their potential making you sick, and therefore it impacts you as even though you may have a better economic level, they're part of your community.
And thank you, John, and for not just speaking to the present moment, but for tying that structural component of why this is an issue, and reminding us that for something like healthcare, I was wanting to interrupt you with amens, and I knew my mic was on, because it is something we're suffering from in this country that's based on structures of racism, structures of economics, and until we can think of healthcare as kind of a human right, if we can reimagine Jesus as the guy who went around giving away free healthcare, maybe that would be a good metaphor for us as Christians, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To be thinking about. So I know we could continue this conversation on for quite a while. I know I have more places I would like to take this, but out of respect for your time and for everyone else here, I want to say thank you, John. This has been enlightening. For a science and math and healthcare guy, you do a great job with your history too, and I think that's been very enlightening for us. So, folks, if you're muted or if you can find your responses, thank you so much, John, and express our appreciation for that. We are grateful to have had you here and to share your voice and your knowledge with us. It's been a wonderful opportunity to learn and grow, and we are grateful for that.
It was really my honor, and again, Dave, I'm indebted to him to allow me to expand my knowledge and provide this. And I did provide my email, so if you're interested in maybe asking questions, drop me a line. Certainly, I'll be glad to help. Or if you need a list of my resources, I'll be glad to do that as well.
Thank you so much, John.
Certainly.
Thank you, John.
I will turn it over to Sandy and Dave, and as we move to close our afternoon together then.
Thank you. And thank you, John, and thank you, Nathan, both of you, for really blessing us today. I'm going to spotlight Dave for any final comments.
Well, thank you, Sandy. And and so let me say it this way: a lot's been said today, and 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 to be able to hear both Nathan and John matters a lot for us. Simply to go down the road is know that the Center of Indigenous Ministry is here to help you as individuals or as congregations to navigate change in favor of Indigenous justice. And the center itself is finding its own way. In the meantime, of pulling things together is know that you can contact me anytime, and I'm more than willing to help you move through there. I just put my contact information so that you can get that. And more than anything else is I personally want to thank Jon for what you had to say today and the meaningfulness of it, the enjoyment of the mountains behind you. Nathan for pulling together a totally new way of going about talking about the doctrine. It's so nice to hear a different way than the way I so often do it as a non-native. And then specifically Sandy and Linda and Clint, thank you for your energy and your commitment to this work. To move ahead on Indigenous justice takes a lot of time, and I know it takes a lot of time in your life to pull this all together. So thank you so much for that, and thank everybody for being here. It's a joy to know that folks have an interest in justice and in looking at a way that in this land that we all find ourselves of, and that so many of us were born upon, that we carry this land within us, the waters of this land within us, and to care deeply about it, I think matters deeply. So thank everybody for being a part of this, and know that that I myself and a number of others in this denomination are here to help work with you on issues of Indigenous justice. Just feel free to contact us at any time, and we'll get back to you.
I believe that Laura Jean is going to close us out today, but thank you all for attending. This has been a wonderful event.
Please join me for our final closing prayer. Divine Creator of all that is and all that ever has been or will be, we praise you for the diversity that surrounds us each and every day of our lives. We thank you for all you have given us, the people, the animals, the land, and so much more. Help us to see our differences and diversity as worthy of celebration and affirmation. Help us to listen and understand, and to meet one another with wonder and anticipation, rather than judgment or skepticism. Help us to love as you love, and guide us into right relationship with all living things. Lead us to examine and understand the ways that we each uphold systems, institutions, and modes of thinking which aim to marginalize our most vulnerable siblings. Open our hearts and minds so that we might truly understand the ways that the sins of colonization, white supremacy, and racism negatively impact each of our lives and prevent all of us from living the way that you would have us. Help us to name the ways that we have actively oppressed those around us, and the times when we have been apathetic or unaffected by the pain of others. Help us to listen compassionately to narratives that are unlike our own, and to honor the experiences of those who have not been afforded the same privileges we have. Raise awareness within each of us of the fact that we do not have it all figured out, and we do not have all the answers. Show us how we might learn from those around us, and help us to consider that our way is not always the only way or the right way. Give us the courage we need to speak up and to challenge the things that simply don't feel right. Grant us the resilience we need to continue to show up and to stand up for what is good and right in the world, even when we face adversity, and even when we come face to face with people who want to censor or silence us. May we seek and create the peace and justice you desire for all of your children. May we love as you love, and may we be advocates for peace, accountability, love, and reconciliation in our hurting world. You never promised that this work would be easy, but you did promise that no matter where we are or where we go, you will be with us. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. May God bless your weekend and your week ahead, that we may have eyes to see and ears to hear and courage and hearts to respond. Go in peace.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
very much.